to create quick gradients in Affinity Photo. Go to the Tools panel, select the elliptical tool and create an ellipse. I'll be adding the gradient to the ellipse. I'm going to zoom in so I can do fine tuning with the gradient. Display the swatches panel, go to the View menu, Studio and Swatches. Go to the Tools panel, select the Gradient tool and then drag the gradient across the shape. It creates a very basic gradient in linear type. You can manipulate the gradient via that line across the shape. Change the length and origin of the gradient via the two end gradient stops. And what you can then do, select one of the end stops and then go to the swatches and change the colour. Go to the other end and select that stop and then go to the swatches and change that colour. At the moment is a very limited colour blend of two colours. You'll notice there's a very thin line in the middle of the gradient. That is the midpoint between the two gradient stops. You can change the blend by changing the midpoint, just drag it either direction. Each combo of gradient stops will have a midpoint, so you can have more pink or more white on your shape. You can move this back and forth all along the gradient line. You will notice though, it does reach a certain point and it will not move any further. It is a fairly boring gradient at the moment. Just add some more stops. Hover over the gradient line, you will see a plus appear. Click there to add a colour stop. It will add the stop with the current colour at that point. You can add more than one stop. To change a colour, click the stop, go over to the swatches and select a new colour. Select another stop and change the colour via the swatches. You can also move the stops. You don't need to leave them in the same position as where you created them. Select a stop and drag. It will move over existing stops as well. As you move the stop, you will see the gradient colour change. You can move the stops around, you can change the colour of the stops and change the midpoints of the gradient stops to create all kinds of amazing gradients. You can also continue to add new stops in between the existing stops. You can crunch the gradient stops together. It is easier to create the gradient stop further away and then drag into a group. You can then generate gradients with nice thin lines of colour. You can fill the gradient with random colours. Maybe hundreds of different colours can be added to that gradient. You can also use this approach to create alternating colours, so red, green, etc. You can also delete the stops by just going to the stop and pressing the delete key. The swatches panel is a great source of colours. The great thing about that is you can get some very harmonious colour schemes added to your gradient, or fill the entire gradient with greys. You can continue to manipulate interactively the gradient over and over again. Keep changing, moving and recolouring stops. Gradients can also be combined, so you don't have to just use one gradient. Maybe you have 3 or 4 different gradients and use blending modes to blend the gradients. Once you're happy with your gradient, you can go to the top bar and then change the type from linear to radial, conical, etc. Change the type to radial. You will still have a single gradient line. Change the centre point as well as the diameter via the end stops. You can still continue to move, remove and add additional stops. So I'm going to add some black around the edge of the gradient. Once you're happy with your gradient, you'll want to save it. Go to the swatches panel, go to the drop down with the greys, colours, etc. and select gradients. You will then see all the gradients currently available in Affinity Photo. To the right of the drop down, you will see a button that adds the current fill to the gradients. However, you will notice that current fill is actually black, so you don't want to add it yet. Deselect the gradient tool by going to the move tool. The current fill will now be set to your gradient. Go back to that button and click, and now your gradient will be added to the swatches. If you click any of the other swatches, the gradient will change. However, you can now go back to your saved gradient and click that. It reapplies it with the stored type of radial. Go to the Tools panel and select the Gradient tool to continue to modify the gradient. You can then add additional stops, etc. Any changes you make to the gradient are not stored, so you have to again save that to the swatches. That colourful swatch is now available for use in all your future projects. You can also use the gradient you've just created with the fill layers via the layer menu. You can also now use your gradient with things like the equations filter to create super dramatic gradient designs. I hope you found this tutorial of interest. I'm always adding new tutorials about Affinity Photo such as equations, gradients and much more. Please subscribe to the Graphic Extras channel. Please add a comment or two, a dislike or like. Thank you much.